and welcome to WITA. You'll just give us a moment for folks to load into our Zoom room. We will get started momentarily. Hello and welcome to WITA. It is our pleasure to welcome you to today's very special event, looking towards the prospect of a trade deal between the United States and China. Today's event is special for two reasons. First, it's our sincere pleasure to host today's event in partnership with Wendy Cutler and our friends at the Asia Society Policy Institute. Wendy and ASPI have been terrific partners with WITA for the past 5 years since we launched our first pandemic-era events together back in March of 2020. Second, today marks the single biggest policy event in WITA's history. We've held some special tariff seminars that have approached these numbers, but with nearly 900 registrations today, we are very grateful to all of you for joining us and our partners at ASPI. At WITA, we plan to announce a couple new events looking at the EU's economic security agenda and U.S. trade with Korea, so keep an eye on your inboxes in the coming days. Both of those events are part of WITA's efforts to reach a wider global audience, and we look forward to sharing more about those events and our future plans outside the United States in the months to come. As you know, if you joined us for some of our webinars in the past, we like to call out the names of some of those you're in community with on Zoom, even if you can't see them on screen. Of course, with nearly 900 people registered from 53 different countries, we can't get to everyone, but I would like to call out some of our distinguished guests. Maureen Pace, the president of the World Trade Center in Dublin, Ambassador Carla Hills, the former United States Trade Representative, Ambassador Don Johnson, the Director Emeritus of the Dean Rusk Center at UGA Law, the former U.S. Ambassador to China and Chairman of the Senate Finance Committee, Max Baucus, and Ambassador Bill Heed, Senior Director at Varens Partners and a former U.S. Ambassador to Cambodia under both Presidents Obama and Trump. It's an honor to have all of you join us today, and welcome to everyone. If you're watching this on Zoom, you can also ask questions of our panel on Zoom using the Q&A tab. You should have also received a copy of today's event program by email, and that email contains a link to see our panelists' biographies. Today's event is the brainchild of my good friend and frequent collaborator, Wendy Cutler, the Vice President of the Asia Society Policy Institute and the former acting Deputy United States Trade Representative. Wendy brought the idea for today's event to WITA, and we want to encourage all of you out there to bring us your ideas for events and speakers. As we've noted on our recent webinars, what we say today on April 22nd is current based on what we know today, but things are changing quickly. So if you're watching this not watching this live, things might have changed. We have a terrific panel assembled here today, starting with my friend, Ambassador Craig Allen, Senior Counselor at the Cohen Group and the former President of the U.S.-China Business Council. Craig, you and I were together in Florida in February of 2020, and you said this pandemic thing is going to be bad. You were right. But thankfully we're through it, but glad to have you on. Craig is joined today by Christopher Adams, a senior advisor at Covington and Burling LLP and the former senior coordinator for China affairs at the Treasury Department. Jeff Gerrish, a partner at Schagrin Associates, former deputy U.S. Trade Representative for Asia, Europe, and the Middle East, and at the Office of the United States Trade Representative. I should have said Ambassador Jeff Gerrish. Sorry about that, Jeff. And Lingling Wei, a reporter at the Wall Street Journal. And of course, our moderator, Wendy Cutler. Wendy, we've assembled a great panel, and I know we're all looking forward to hearing what can be done, if something can be done, to end this trade war and end some of the uncertainty facing businesses, workers, and consumers in the U.S., China, and around the world. Wendy?
Well, thanks so much, Ken, and we very much love partnering with you, and thanks for being so enthusiastic when I brought this idea to you. And I think that with this large turnout today, I think we were on target, that this is an issue of interest to many folks. To state the obvious, trade tensions between the United States and China are serious, with each side now having imposed tariffs over 100% on each other, as well as using non-tariff tools as well. China seems to be digging in for the long haul, saying that they will fight until the end, while the US now is very busy negotiating with up to 90 countries during this 90-day negotiating pause time. But at the same time, both sides have been sending signals that they may be interested in getting back to the negotiating table. But it seems that neither one wants to make the first move, worried that it may signal weakness. And so with that context, our webinar today will examine some key questions, including what would it take for the US and China to get back to the negotiating table? Once at the table, what would each side be seeking? And what are the prospects for a meaningful and durable deal? We have an excellent panel to discuss these matters, and I'm going to start with some questions directly to them, but then we'll take some questions from the audience. I would just ask you, if you put questions in the Q&A box, try and keep them as short as possible. When you moderate, it's really hard to read long text, and sometimes we can't even find the question, so that would help enormously. So with that, let's get going. And Jeff, I'm going to start with you. And, we're seeing different signals coming from the administration with respect to China, including some tough actions being taken, but as well as some conciliatory signs that, maybe we should get back to the negotiating table. So I was wondering, maybe to kick it off, you can help us sort out how should we view this administration's policy towards China, particularly when it comes to trade and tariff matters. Over to you, Jeff.
Great. Thank you, Wendy, and good morning, everyone. There certainly has been an interesting dichotomy between some of the actions being taken by the president and the administration and the statements being made, particularly by the president himself. On the one hand, you have very, very strong actions being taken with massive tariff increases of up to 145%. And tough actions being taken in the Section 301 investigation just last week on China's maritime and shipbuilding practices, as well as on the export control front. And on the other hand, you have the president talking about re-engaging with China and possibly doing a trade deal with China. And, but really, this is just classic Donald Trump. He takes very tough actions, he builds maximum leverage, and then he talks up a deal to bring the other side to the table. And the president really sees himself as a master negotiator and a deal maker, and he sees himself as able to get a deal done with China that would reset the economic relationship that we have and this fundamentally imbalanced trade relationship that we have in a way that no one else has been able to do. He doesn't have the same philosophical or ideological beliefs that I think some of his team have with respect to China. But I think he's also not in a big hurry to get a deal done. His team certainly is not in a big hurry to get a deal done. They really want to focus on the negotiations that they're doing with the other countries that are subject to the reciprocal tariffs that did receive the 90-day pause. They want to get the best deals that they possibly can get with those countries to try to rebalance our trade relationships with those countries, but also even beyond that, to try to isolate China. They want to bring these countries more into an economic bloc or trading bloc with the United States and outside of the orbit of China, but also they are trying to get them to reduce their relationship and dealings with China. They really want these countries to take strong action to cut off circumvention and transshipment of Chinese goods through their countries to avoid the US tariffs, and to get them to really crack down on Chinese investment in those countries to get around the tariffs, and really just to get them to minimize the amount by which they absorb China's excess capacity and exports as well. And, I think we may see an agreement, or maybe even more than one agreement, happening in the next couple of weeks on that. And I think that would be important for the administration to show that this strategy is bearing fruit and is working. But by doing this, I think his team wants to build maximum pressure on China and build up maximum leverage over China to try to get the best deal possible if negotiations or when negotiations do occur. Now, I think there are of course, certain elements in the administration, the hardest of the hardliners who would never want to negotiate or do a deal with China. But I also think there are more pragmatic members of the administration and of the president's team that recognize that negotiations are likely to take place at some point. First, because the president will likely want to do negotiations and they have to be ready when that time comes. But also because I think they recognize that right now, with the level of tariffs that both countries have on each other, we essentially have a trade embargo in place, which likely is not sustainable over the long term. So I think they will see the need for negotiations to really stabilize the relationship, at least as we move forward. Now, exactly what form that will take and what will be the subject of those negotiations is another question, and it's something I think we'll talk a lot more about as we move on.
And just a quick follow-up. How is the White House, how do they assess their negotiating leverage vis-a-vis China?
I think they view it as very strong. And I think if they are able to get additional deals done with other countries that they're negotiating with, I think they see that leverage even increasing. But I think that what they see is that the United States has ultimate leverage in the form of access to the US market. Although China has reduced its exports here to the US to some degree, they cannot replace the level of exports that they have to the U.S. and the economic relationship that they have with the U.S. in terms of trying to export to other countries. That simply is not going to be possible. And if they do, I think you're going to see even more actions being taken by those countries. We've already seen that to some degree already with other countries putting tariffs on Chinese products. Obviously, we saw it with the EU on EVs, with Canada. India is taking action. Turkey, I think they're also in South America, we're seeing action. So I think the administration, the White House sees themselves as having a great deal of leverage. And I think they're right now content to wait and see and hopefully bringing the Chinese to the table at some point. But I think they're going to continue to try to build that leverage through these deals that they're doing with other countries.
Well, thanks. Maybe now we can go over to Ling Ling. Maybe you can kind of give us the view from Beijing. Does Beijing think it has leverage here? I mean, the Chinese economy is weak. They clearly want U.S. companies to stay in China. Exports are the bright spot, in terms of their GDP growth. So how are they viewing, this dispute, and how do you evaluate their determination to be in this for the long haul and being able to really absorb and live through kind of the economic downfall that they'll be experiencing? And furthermore, after you've answered all those questions, do you think they're interested in coming back to the negotiating table? And if so, why? Is this just because they want to delay things, or you think they are interested in reaching some type of deal with the Trump White House?
Sure. Thank you so much, Wendy. All excellent questions. And I'm incredibly honored and humbled to be here. Try my best to answer those questions. We cannot overstate the importance of this moment we're in. Jeff just gave a very detailed rundown on how the administration and President Trump himself, view the current trade war with China. From Beijing's perspective, they are seeing this more than a trade war. It's basically an all-out effort by the United States to isolate China economically, diplomatically, and geopolitically. Jeff mentioned earlier, the effort by the administration to try to cut deals with other countries and forming blocs to isolate China. That's basically convinced the Chinese belief. So in China's view, it's really a struggle over ideology and ultimately a contest between two vastly different systems. I want to call your attention to some recent official messaging coming out of Beijing. They basically have gone as far as to evoke the Korean War when Chinese troops supported North Korea against a US-backed South Korea. They're doing that to try to rally the nation, to gird the nation for a very long-term struggle against the United States. It really suggests a willingness, a very strong willingness on the leadership's part to endure economic challenges. And they're preparing the whole nation for that. You mentioned earlier, Wendy, that China's economy right now is weak, is struggling. That's definitely the fact. Even before the current tit for tat economic warfare, China's economy was in serious trouble. We have seen, multi-year long property downturn, wiping out trillions of dollars household wealth. We have seen local governments, struggling with mountains of debt, even trying to make ends meet. And we have seen worsening deflationary pressure because of Xi Jinping's manufacturing-centric policy. So, they all showed economically China is not in a very strong position to fight this warfare. However, what Xi Jinping has is the Chinese system is built in a way that it's ready to basically fight this long-term, struggle against the United States. You also mentioned earlier, Wendy, that Beijing seems to also have, left the room open for negotiations. For sure, precisely because of the economic weakness we talked about earlier, they definitely want to sit down and have serious negotiations with the United States and try to basically, get the US to pull back on some of the, tariffs, export controls, that already in place. But it does, but because, how China views this trade war, it does raise question whether any kind of negotiations from China's part would be a genuine effort to find common ground or merely a delaying tactic aimed at basically mitigating immediate economic pressures. I would add one more thing and I'll stop. So basically for Xi Jinping, yes, politically he's in a strong position to play the long game. President Trump faces, midterm elections, right? Faces a huge battle, a big test next year when the United States have midterm elections. Xi Jinping does not. The Communist Party does not have elections to worry about. However, the economic pressure is building up in China. We have seen already, especially small-sized, medium-sized factories, really struggling to keep afloat. We have seen unemployment issues keep getting worse. So he might have to, that means Xi Jinping really might have to find a way to negotiate with the US and try to get a deal done. But because he has sort of like boxed himself in with such a hardline stance against the United States, the deal would be such that he wouldn't look weak, right? So that really also causing question what kind of a deal, if there's one, would look like ultimately. So that's basically my take for now.
Okay. And just a quick follow-up. I mean, the phase one deal was largely the benefits went to the United States, right? And the US made very few concessions, maybe some cosmetic language that made it look like we were undertaking obligations. And Jeff, you get a lot of credit there for that. This time around, though, could China really agree to a pact that really had benefits skewed towards the United States? Would unwinding some of the tariffs be enough for them, or would they have their own demands when they get to the table?
Oh, China definitely will have a lot of demands when if they go when they go to the table. Um, I think they will try to be more aggressive this time, even more aggressive this time around, because ultimately, it's also a race over who buckles from the pain first, right? Their calculus involves the United States would surrender first because of the inflationary pressure, because of the upcoming midterm elections. So that to China is advantage. So, if the negotiations were to occur under circumstances where President Trump reaches out to Xi first and try to start the whole process, that would put China in an even stronger position. They definitely would want to roll back the tariffs. Uh, Potentially even more important than tariffs are export controls. The relaxation of export control is very key to the Xi leadership because Xi's ambition to build China into an even greater industrial and technological superpower. They still need to access American technology to fulfill that ambition. So export controls, in a sense, are even more important than tariffs. But tariffs are also important, especially for the the export oriented businesses. And one more thing that's unrelated to trade, I wonder might also be on the table. This issue is Taiwan. So I do not know whether or not China would put that on the table when they start the trade negotiations, or they will try to make it a broader negotiation about try to define the relationship. So if that's the case, Taiwan inevitably would be put on the table by the Chinese.
So this is getting more and more complicated.
Yeah,
Craig,
no, I'm sorry to that.
no, that's okay. Craig, over to you. And you worked for years with the U.S. business community when you were president of the U.S.-China Business Council. How did the business community was very complimentary of the phase one agreement. If there was going to be a phase two agreement, what would be of particular importance to the U.S. business community? It would be getting rid of, well, the existing tariffs, but also unwinding non-tariff measures, or is it boosting more consumer demand in China, or more structural changes addressing state-owned enterprises, activities, and subsidies?
Well, thank you, Wendy, and thank you for your and Ken's leadership on these difficult issues. Let me start out by reciting some of the current concerns of the U.S. business community that haven't yet been mentioned. Now, China has replied, as China always replies, to trade provocations with a tit-for-tat plus type of strategy. And they have put in tariffs of 125% on American exports into China. But also, the concerns of the American business community right now are some of the, if you will, non-tariff responses by the Chinese government. And I won't go into it in detail, but it's important to note that there are new antitrust investigations that are as a result of the tariffs. A number of companies have been put on the unreliable entities list. There is talk of investigations into standards essential patents and other IP issues. Are Chinese companies paying too much for those patents? But probably most important is China has quite significantly expanded its own export control mandates to cover rare earths, specialty metals, and other products that are, in often cases, China might be a dominant or even a monopoly supplier over some of those. So all American companies operating in China are concerned about that, and obviously wish to stay out of the fray, if you will. Now, I think American companies are concerned about both the inbound tariffs into the U.S. and also the outbound tariffs into China. And I think Jeff hit it just beautifully when he said effectively it's a trade embargo. And so we're going to have to, all of the American companies who were reliant on American exports are very concerned about that. I think we're going to find the 145% tariffs are going to have a large impact on American manufacturing, American retail, probably American medical services. So companies in the U.S. who rely on Chinese imports are going to be facing shortages or higher prices or both in the near term. And that's inevitable. What I would argue that is of greatest concern to American exporters and American companies who are invested in China are these tariffs and getting to more uncertainty. But if you look at the larger phase one and the phase two issues, it comes under the rubric of a level playing field, and there are many parts to that. One of them is paring back of state-owned enterprises' kind of dominance of all the industries where they are represented. Another one is more equal and predictable intellectual property right protections. Market access should be improved across the board, particularly in the manufacturing sector. In addition to that, there are macroeconomic concerns. Chinese consumption is just inherently far too low. Chinese household consumption is only 40% of GDP compared to nearly 65% of GDP in the OECD. So those macroeconomic concerns really have to be addressed if the larger issues are to be resolved. And unfortunately, I see very few signs that the Chinese government is willing to engage in both the fiscal reforms and the macroeconomic reforms that would give Chinese consumers the confidence that they need to boost their consumption. And let's recall, if Chinese household consumption is at only 40 percentage points of GDP, what we really would like to see would be household consumption at 55, 60%. So that's 20 percentage points of GDP. So the macroeconomic issues here are fundamental. Those are the issues that, Wendy, you worked on in the JCCT and the SNED. They remain unresolved. I see very few efforts by the Chinese government to look at those larger macroeconomic issues, which at the heart of this are the source of the problem that we are dealing with today, not only bilaterally, but China on a global basis and the global trade architecture. Let me stop there. Thank you.
Okay, so this negotiation's getting more and more complicated with each speaker. Now, Chris, over to you. You've had an extensive career working at USTR, Treasury, and our embassy over in Beijing. So you've been on calls and in meetings about trying to get the two sides together. And I was wondering, is there anything you can share with the audience that, based on your experience, do you think, like, how would you orchestrate getting the US and China back to the table? I mean, is it even in the cards now as China gets more and more public about how it's doubling down? And who would be like the interlocutor to kind of make this happen in your view? Would it be the Treasury Secretary who's been in charge of US-China economic relations for many, many years?
Well, thanks, Wendy. It's really great to be with such an expert panel. In the past, when we've had a structured negotiation with China, it's usually been either because we have a mechanism in place that we can plug into, or we have a meeting between the two presidents and they announce some new process. At this point, we obviously don't have an existing mechanism. The negotiating teams don't have a mandate, and we have very little trust between two sides. So I think what we really need is a clear signal from the two presidents, preferably jointly, indicating that they agreed to start talks, and just as importantly, as you alluded to, who on each side will lead the talks. Prior to the phase one negotiation, that was really initiated with a meeting that the two presidents had in Buenos Aires in December 2018, where President Trump and President Xi announced that they would commence this negotiation. And President Trump made it very clear that Ambassador Lighthizer would be leading from the US side, and the Chinese made clear that Vice Premier Liu He would be leading from their side. So that would be the ideal situation. And it really not only kickstarts the negotiation, but it provides an ongoing mandate. We often hear the Chinese side referring to, we're implementing the consensus of the two leaders. Now, sometimes there's, some disagreement about exactly what that consensus is, but it's something that gives a mandate and authority for the negotiations to continue. Now, of course, where we are now is as you said, who's gonna pick up who's gonna call first. It's understandable that President Xi may not want to have a formal meeting to avoid unwelcome surprises. So maybe a phone call is somewhat lower risk and could be easier to control. But we really need to get past the pride factor and make this call. Perhaps even a clear public statement by the presidents, followed by a cabinet meeting, could suffice. But again, a key element of this communication needs to be, particularly on the U.S. side, I got to say, who is going to lead this negotiation, aside from obviously the president having his own role. Because it seems clear on the Chinese side that they've designated Vice Premier He Feng to be the senior level interlocutor. And I would add to that, personally, I'm encouraged that below his level, that MOFCOM has brought the ambassador to the WTO, Li Chenggang, back from Geneva to Beijing, and appointed him to be the chief trade representative with full minister rank in Beijing. Wendy, you and I know him. I think others maybe on this webinar know him. He's highly regarded as a constructive interlocutor. When I was the USTR rep in Beijing, I used to negotiate settlements to WTO disputes when that was something that was still possible. So I think that's positive. But we still hear on the Chinese side that they don't know who to talk to. They don't know who has President Trump's ear. They don't know who they should be negotiating with. So I think that's really important. On the U.S. side, having, as you mentioned, having worked at USTR Treasury and Commerce, maybe I can be somewhat unbiased here. And, I think given the focus on tariffs and non-tariff barriers, I really think that, substantively, it needs to be Ambassador Greer at USTR leading the negotiation. Certainly, Secretary Besant and even Secretary Lutnick could have a role, but I think USTR needs to be leading on the substance. And I think I see some nodding heads, so maybe we have agreement on that. I do think back channels can help facilitate, and they can provide some insights to each side, but I don't think they're a substitute for the front channel in starting a negotiation and making it sustainable. And of course, once we get through this first hurdle, there'll need to be a discussion by the two leaders of negotiation over what should be on the table, over the scope of the negotiation. And that, in my experience, sometimes takes some time, especially when you're starting a new process as we would be now.
Yeah, I just noted that overnight, the USTR announced that the terms of reference for our negotiation with India were just agreed on, and I think that took over 2 or 3 months. So when I look at this 90-day negotiating period, it's so difficult for me to see like how all these countries could conclude deals within that time period. But I know people are working hard. Jeff, maybe I can turn to you now. I mean, you were an important lead in the phase 1 negotiations. We clearly put stuff on the table that China didn't like or they didn't act on, and you all decided that the deal was going to cover a certain range of issues, with some issues probably needing to wait for another negotiation. I mean, in your view, what's the unfinished business of the phase 1 agreement that could become part of the terms of reference for a negotiation with China?
Well, there certainly are a number of items that were on the table, as you mentioned, as part of the phase 1 discussions, because really before they became the phase 1 discussions, when we were having a larger negotiation, among those were negotiations on subsidies, disciplines on state-owned enterprises, discussions relating to overcapacity in China. Also, there was a lot of talk about China's use, or I would say misuse, of the anti-monopoly law and their secure and controllable practices and policies. There's cybersecurity law and cryptography law that were either being implemented or in place. And then, on IP, there were a lot of discussions relating to data protection for pharmaceuticals and some other issues which we were not able to conclude. And on the, services, more in the services realm, there are a lot of discussions on cloud computing, cross-border data transfers, and some other areas of services as well. And we made progress on some of those areas. I would say a lot of progress on really key issues like subsidies and state-owned enterprises, and less progress on some other areas. Cloud computing was a difficult one, as were the cross-border data transfer issues. But those could form the basis for a subsequent set of negotiations. But I would caution everyone that those would have been difficult to negotiate, even just immediately following up on the phase 1 discussions. Even if COVID had never happened and some other actions had never happened, those would have been incredibly difficult. The fact is, even though we made progress on some of those issues, the negotiations broke down. They were not able to get it through their own political process in China. While Vice Premier Leah Hood was very forward-leaning on some of those issues, and we were making some progress there, it was difficult for them to get it through their own political system. So I think it would have been very difficult even then. It's become even a more formidable challenge at this point because of what's happened since then. The two countries have taken a much more confrontational approach to each other, even before President Trump entered office. And I think there's a level of distrust as well between the two countries and their governments. So I think it would be even more difficult to try to get something like that done. And I'm not sure that the members of the president's team really want to engage in a negotiation where they're seeking reform and structural changes in China. And so they'd be less willing to go down that route. And I think they're still feeling burned by the fact that even in the phase one agreement, there was a failure to comply with the obligations, not just on the purchases, which a lot of people focus on, but on some of the structural elements of the agreement as well. So I think it would be very, very difficult. And I think there's a low likelihood that we're going to see this sort of fulsome negotiation happening on all these issues that were left on the table in the initial set of negotiations.
To follow up on excess capacity, and that was an issue, sure, during phase one. It's really become more and more of an issue. And as you mentioned, not just for the United States, but for other countries as well. You could argue that with some big structural reform, including boosting domestic demand, as well as not producing so much, China could take care of this problem itself, but instead it is just exporting a lot. I'd just be interested, how do you think, if going into a negotiation, we should look at this issue in terms of what a solution could be? And how do you feel about voluntary export restraints? Do you think this is something that the administration would look seriously at?
Yeah, I do think that the administration would look seriously at voluntary export restraints. I think that would be one potential action that could be taken to address the overcapacity problem and help to rebalance our relationship with China. And of course, we've used voluntary export restraints in the past fairly successfully, including even in the 80s with Japan and other countries. So those are real possibilities here that could be something that the administration would want to look to. The overcapacity problem is a massive, massive problem. And unfortunately, really all China has done more recently is doubled down on their economic model of building domestic manufacturing, building capacity, and the emphasis on exports. And as you mentioned, and other countries are feeling this. I think with the G7 countries, just as a whole, the China's surplus with those countries grew by a third over a recent period, and has really tripled with some of the less developed countries around the world as well. So, and of course, China most recently had a trade surplus of $1 trillion, which is just mind-boggling. So it's a real problem. I mean, the real thing that in addition to maybe something on voluntary export restraints, I think Craig hit it on the head. They really need to do something about the consumption issue in China and the lack of domestic consumption. I think that really needs to change for this to turn around in any meaningful way. The problem is, I just don't know that President Xi and the Chinese government is going to want to take steps to address that situation. I think they view Western style consumption as something that's a problem and not something they want to move towards. So I just don't know that they're really going to be willing to take the steps necessary to address that issue.
So maybe voluntary export restraints may look more attractive to Beijing than stimulating their domestic demand. Ling, if you want to comment on that, that's fine. I did want to ask you something. In the past 24 hours, China has sent a warning to other countries negotiating with the United States that be careful what you agree to with the US, because if you do things that are against our interest, we are going to take countermeasures. Is that a fair summary of it? And is this sending a chill in the negotiating rooms in Washington this week?
Well, I think that's really good point you made, Wendy. Um, the background for this statement was China issued a statement. Guess what? Right after Xi Jinping came back from Vietnam, came back from Cambodia, came back from Malaysia. That indicates his trip was less than a success. He didn't get what he wanted in Vietnam, in potential. I'm not so sure about Cambodia because their trade with US is so little. But at least in Vietnam and Malaysia, that's a question mark too. So basically, that shows China is getting increasingly anxious about the United States actually succeeding in cutting deals with other countries that have this huge China component in it, as Jeff and Christopher said earlier. This effort to isolate China. So I think that shows one anxiety on Beijing's part because Xi's recent trip to Southeast Asia hasn't been as successful as they wanted it to be. And at the same time, it's also unfortunately for China, is basically another example of the tit for tat. It doesn't just apply to the United States. It actually applies to all the other countries that they think are hurting China, or more precisely, Beijing's interest. It's not the way to make friends. So I think that also shows, just like the United States, the Trump administration right now, China also thinks it has the upper hand. It also the time is also on their side. They can afford to play the long game. You don't hurt me. If you do anything that hurts me, I'm gonna strike back. Same playbook as they have used with the United States. The overcapacity issue, all of you have mentioned, I completely 100% agree. It's such a huge issue. If the leadership were just to change its economic policy, right, to significantly uh, uh, step up fiscal support for households, beef up Chinese domestic consumption, they could easily absorb the tariffs from the United States. Here's why. China's exports to the United States are a fraction of China's domestic consumption, as evidenced by retail sales. So all China has to do is to beef up, according to most recent research by Capital Economics, all China has to do is to beef up domestic consumption by as little as 5%. They could absorb the loss of exports as a result of the US exports tariffs. So all they have to do is that. It sounds easy enough, right? But it's hugely difficult. It means the government fundamentally has to change the economic model, right? Instead of supporting factories that are churning out stuff no one's buying domestically, they have to support household by investing heavily in the people, right? The pensions, healthcare, education, all that stuff. But though, guess what? That investment doesn't immediately produce GDP. It takes time for that investment to pay off. But the leadership, one, they do not have the patience. They need to reach the 5% goal, regardless of what. So they will have to keep investing in infrastructure, roads to nowhere, bridges to nowhere, right? They have to keep investing in manufacturing. And also there's a strategic ambition on Xi Jinping's part, which is, continue to get China so entrenched in global supply chain, making the rest of the world making very hard for the rest of the world to reduce their reliance on Chinese components. So that's part of the grand strategy. He's not going to change that, without some kind of huge economic crisis, right? So I think that, I just wanted to just add a little bit more explanation to what Jeff and Chris and Craig already laid out so perfectly about this urgent need for China to change. I mean, the US tariffs are bad, isolating China if the US succeeds really bad. But China can do so much more to avoid those consequences, but they're not doing that.
Craig, another issue I want to just get on the table is one big change between phase one and now is that many more Chinese companies are invested in third countries. Some or most of this aimed at avoiding US tariffs, depending on the country. How do you go after this in a trade agreement with China, or is this more a subject of negotiation with the third countries?
So you are absolutely correct, Wendy, that a lot of the production has moved to Vietnam, Mexico, and elsewhere. There's also a lot of trade divergence, trade going from China through Mexico into Vietnam and then into the US. Some of that legal, some of that illegal. Those countries largely welcome Chinese investment and want as much Chinese investment in manufacturing, preferably greenfield manufacturing as possible, both for the domestic market and the international market. But an important footnote here is that a lot of the owners of those companies are not Chinese, they're Taiwan, Hong Kong, Japanese, or Korean owners who have moved in part or in whole production chains out of China. Now, how to get at that is your question, and I'd say that this is devilishly hard. The administration, my understanding, is talking about looking into ownership of companies, and if there's Chinese ownership of a company in Mexico, depending on the share of that ownership, that those goods might be determined to have come from China, not Mexico.
So you mean moving off, looking at the origin of the product to the nationality of the supplier?
Of the owner of the facility. The problem with that is that ownership can be hidden or changed, and that it to me seems exceptionally difficult to take ownership into account when looking at either a safeguard, a countervailing duty, or anti-dumping investigation. So if we are to make those changes, looking at the ownership of a third country manufacturing facility, then I think we have a lot of technical challenges ahead of us to determine that Chinese name it might be a domestic Chinese company or a domestic Chinese citizen of Mexico or Vietnam or wherever. So I think we'll have our work cut out for us if we are to expand the anti-dumping countervailing duty investigations to include ownership of third country facilities. Thank you.
Wendy, if you wouldn't mind, if I could just
absolutely.
And I certainly agree with everything that Craig just said, and I do think this will really be focused more on the negotiations that they do with the other countries that are ongoing now. But also, the United States can take unilateral action on this. And in fact, if you look at the action that was taken last week in the Section 301 investigation on shipbuilding and maritime practices, the proposed tariffs on ship-to-shore cranes and cargo handling equipment would apply to companies that are owned, controlled, or substantially influenced by Chinese companies. So they are expanding this. They are actually looking at it already in this context. And I could see this being a template for something they will try to do going forward in other contexts as well.
Yeah, I think I couldn't agree more, but I think there will be practical problems in implementing, right? And I think our export control people have learned that as companies change names or they have joint ventures or they disappear, then they come back. Chris, I wanted to ask you a little about what China might want in a negotiation. We've heard export controls, and we've gotten a few questions from viewers. Do you think the U.S. has any, I'm going to stack this question by my tone, do you think the U.S. has any flexibility with respect to export controls to relax them in response to a Chinese demand? And beyond export controls and unwinding tariffs, do you think China would be interested, for example, in more investment opportunities in the United States, or what would they be seeking in a negotiation?
Yeah, that's a good question. And, it does appear that early in this administration, that China was very interested in putting on the table a proposal for an increase in purchases and an increase in investment in the U.S. They didn't get much traction. For investment to be part of this deal, it would really require a paradigm shift in terms of the national security framework which has been really a bipartisan consensus. Because if you had, large investments in what are considered to be sensitive or strategic industries like, EV batteries, et cetera, that would really require a change in thinking. Now, President Trump has more than once publicly indicated that could be appealing to him, to have Chinese companies invest in the United States rather than, as we were just discussing, in places like Mexico. But for the national security community, many of President Trump's advisors, that would be something that they would be arguing against. And politically, it may not be a winner. I think getting back to the managed trade type of solution that you and Jeff were just discussing, one additional part of that, and I completely agree with the points that Jeff made on voluntary export restraints. And by the way, those can involve setting price floors as well as limiting quantities. And that's something that the European Union is actually negotiating on right now with regard to EVs, possibly replacing tariffs with minimum prices. But another element could be, a restructuring of the current very prohibitive tariffs, the trade embargo, to something more rational. It could be, reducing or even eliminating tariffs in sectors and products where, are not sensitive from a national security standpoint, and where there isn't a real serious problem of excess capacity that, would put at risk U.S. industries. And so, there's probably a lot that could be done in that. And what we might actually get to, somewhat ironically, I could, at least maybe as an initial stage, could look something like the legislation that has been proposed by the House Select Committee Chair John Molinar, which would revoke China's PNTR status. Which, let's set that aside for a moment, because that is something that, from the Chinese perspective, is I think a very symbolic and even psychological issue. Because it indicates that the foundation of the U.S.-China trade relationship is being dismantled. But setting that symbolic issue aside, the tariff structure that bill called for is 100% tariffs on sensitive items and 35% tariffs on non-sensitive items, phased in over 5 years. And now we're obviously way beyond that, but in that, when it was proposed, was a very seen as a very aggressive proposal. But we could at least move back to that, I think, as part of a rational restructuring of the tariffs, and then maybe even go further in that direction.
Interesting. We're running out of time. I thought we'd just do a quick round robin. I'm going to ask everyone to just weigh in on the question. Do you see us getting back to the negotiating table with China? And if so, when? You can give a season. You don't have to give an actual date. And we're not going to hold you to this, but you are the experts. Craig, I'm going to start with you.
Okay. I think that it depends on whether or not the Chinese take aggressive actions against fentanyl to eliminate fentanyl from the dark web and to arrest, prosecute, and punish the fentanyl manufacturers. Those are the table stakes. And if the Chinese are able to do that, then I think that negotiations are possible. I look forward to that day. Thank you.
Ling Ling.
100% agreed with Craig. China definitely needs to show, some kind of willingness and concrete action to show to the United States, they're sincere about some genuine negotiations. Talk about lessons from the first round, the trade war 1.0. A big mistake I think both sides made was they overestimate their own strengths and leverage, right? The fentanyl issue, China made a huge miscalculation there. When Trump first slapped China with 10% tariffs on fentanyl, China should have responded, but they didn't. They look at it as a issue that if you already exerting pressure on us and doing this, and we already helped you so much on this issue, what more can we get from you? They look at it really as something they can transact with the United States without realizing how serious the fentanyl issue is to the United States, not just to the president himself and for millions of American people here. So they really miscalculated by not responding to the fentanyl related tariffs. And I completely agree with Bragg that they need to do something like that to get at least the Trump administration to think about reaching out to the Chinese side, the senior level, have a conversation.
So, Jeff, do you think a down payment by China is critical to getting talks underway?
I think it would be important for them to do some sort of down payment, and I think Craig and Lingling have touched on something which would be very important to the president and as a down payment. So I think that certainly could help kick things off. And I really don't expect that there's going to be negotiations though until after there's really been enough time to negotiate with these other countries that are subject to the reciprocal tariffs. I think the administration is going to want to see some fruit coming out of that and to put maximum pressure on China. So we have the 90-day period. I would not be surprised to see that get extended. We saw that even with the phase one trade deal with the original 90-day period getting extended. I could see if we're making progress that may get extended out. But I also would not expect this to lead to some sort of grand bargain. I think we're going to see something if they're, when the negotiations do happen, it's going to be something more modest. And maybe we get back to the tariff levels that were in place right after Liberation Day, before all the additional tit for tat occurred. So those are still very high tariff levels, obviously. But interestingly, more in line with what Chris was talking about in terms of, where the PNTR levels were for the legislation to revoke China's PNTR status. So, but that's sort of where I see us going, most likely, given where things stand right now.
And Chris, the last word is yours.
Yeah, these are all great points. I agree with the point that that fentanyl could be a good confidence building agreement. There may be others. High profile purchases could also help improve the environment. I also agree with Jeff that I think at least the administration would want to show some success in some of these other negotiations before starting a serious negotiation with China. So China's probably maybe not at the end of the line, but certainly not at the front of the line.
Well, great. So with that, I want to thank everyone for joining us. It was a great discussion, and I'm going to turn it back to my colleague, Ken.
Thanks, Wendy. Terrific conversation. Wendy, any last words on your behalf?
I personally think we are going to get back to the table, but it's one thing to launch a negotiation. It's another thing to finalize it. And I thought it was difficult even before this webinar, but hearing everyone's input, the agenda would have to be so huge. So I come to where Jeff is, that if we were go back to the table, it would need to be more modest and more about managing the relationship rather than some big bargain with big breakthroughs that may never be implemented.
Well, that's a groundwork for future conversations for the governments and certainly for WITA and ASPE. Wendy, thank you for helping pull this together and for partnering with WITA on this and other events. Craig, pleasure to see you again. Jeff, Christopher, Lingling, real pleasure to have you all on the WITA webinar platform. Thank you all for joining us. Thanks to our audience for being with us today. Really grateful for all of you joining us. If you missed any part of this, we will have the video of this available shortly. Thanks all for joining us, and we look forward to seeing everybody again soon. Be well.